In October 1962, two men held the fate of every human being on Earth in their hands. One sat in the White House, the other sat in the Kremlin. Between them, they commanded the largest nuclear arsenals the world had ever seen, more than enough to devastate civilization. For 13 days, humanity stood on the edge of something it had never faced before, its own deliberate extinction. But here's what almost nobody knows. The moment the world came closest to ending wasn't in Washington nor in Moscow. It was deep beneath the ocean, inside a Soviet submarine cut off from all communication, where its captain had become convinced that nuclear war had already begun and was preparing to launch a nuclear torpedo. One man, whose name the world would not learn for another 40 years, refused to let it happen. A U-2 spy plane flew over Cuba and captured 928 photographs in just 6 minutes. Its pilot later admitted he feared history would remember him as the man who started World War III. On the single most dangerous day of the crisis, an American aircraft was shot down by a Soviet commander acting entirely on his own authority, without orders from Moscow. And one of the three leaders at the center of this crisis wrote a letter urging a nuclear first strike on the United States under one condition. So how did 13 days in October 1962 bring humanity to within a single man's decision of extinction? And why are we still here? The answer to the second question is even more unsettling than the first. To understand what happened in October 1962, you first have to understand the world those 13 days nearly destroyed. By 1962, the United States and the Soviet Union had been locked in the Cold War for nearly 2 decades. They had never fought each other directly. They didn't need to. Together, they commanded the largest nuclear arsenals the world had ever seen. The strategy was known as mutual assured destruction. The logic was brutally simple. If either side launched a nuclear attack, the other would retaliate with overwhelming force, guaranteeing the destruction of both. As long as both believed that outcome was inevitable, neither would dare strike first. It was, in its own terrifying way, the most fragile peace humanity had ever known. But by 1962, that fragile peace was beginning to crack. In April 1961, President John F. Kennedy approved a CIA-backed invasion of Cuba by around 1,400 Cuban exiles, hoping to overthrow Fidel Castro's communist government. The invasion landed at the Bay of Pigs on April 17 and collapsed within 2 days. Castro's forces crushed it. More than 1,100 of the invaders were captured. Kennedy, barely 3 months into his presidency, had suffered a humiliating defeat before the entire world. At the same time, the United States had stationed nuclear missiles in Turkey, within striking distance of the Soviet Union. To Khrushchev, they represented a constant reminder that American nuclear weapons stood just minutes from Soviet territory. So in July 1962, Khrushchev reached a secret agreement with Castro. The Soviet Union would deploy nuclear missiles to Cuba, just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. The plan served 3 purposes. It would protect Cuba from another American invasion, counter the U.S. missiles in Turkey, and demonstrate that the Soviet Union could match American power anywhere in the world. Khrushchev was convinced the missiles would be in place before the United States discovered them. He was wrong. On the morning of October 14, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane lifted off from a base in Florida and climbed high over Cuba. Its pilot, Major Richard Hazer, spent just 6 minutes over the island, capturing 928 photographs. Years later, he admitted he feared history would remember him as the man who started a war. The next day, CIA photo analysts examined those images frame by frame. What they discovered stopped them cold. Scattered across the Cuban countryside were unmistakable Soviet medium-range ballistic missile sites under construction. Once operational, those missiles could strike much of the eastern United States in little more than 10 minutes. On the morning of October 16th, the photographs were placed before President John F. Kennedy. His first response was not panic, it was discipline. He immediately assembled a small group of his closest advisors, a team that would become known simply as ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. Nobody outside that room was to know what they had discovered. Not the Soviets, not the American public, not even the press. As the rest of the world went about its ordinary business, completely unaware of the danger, a handful of men behind closed doors in the White House were quietly debating decisions that could determine the future of humanity. For the next 6 days, ExComm argued over every possible course of action. Launch an immediate airstrike before the missiles became operational. Invade Cuba and remove Castro by force. Establish a naval blockade to prevent additional Soviet weapons from reaching the island, or pursue diplomacy and hope the crisis could be resolved without war. Many of Kennedy's military advisors strongly favored an immediate airstrike. Destroy the missile sites before they could be used. Kennedy listened carefully. Then he asked a question no one in the room could answer with confidence. What happens next? What would the Soviet Union do after American bombs killed Soviet soldiers in Cuba? Would Moscow retaliate in Europe? Would the conflict spiral into nuclear war? No one could say. Kennedy had already seen how confident predictions had collapsed during the Bay of Pigs. He refused to gamble the fate of the world on assumptions that might prove disastrously wrong. Instead, he chose a naval quarantine. He deliberately avoided the word blockade because under international law, a blockade is considered an act of war. On the evening of October 22, 1962, President John F. Kennedy addressed the nation on live television and radio. He revealed that the Soviet Union was secretly deploying nuclear missiles in Cuba. He also announced about the naval quarantine around the island. And finally, he demanded that the Soviet Union remove the missiles. Then he issued one of the clearest nuclear warnings ever delivered by an American president. Any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere, he declared, would be regarded as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response. The night before, most people had gone to bed unaware that the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. By the morning of October 23, everyone knew. Meanwhile, Soviet cargo ships were already steaming toward Cuba, carrying additional military equipment. One question now dominated governments, military headquarters, newsrooms, and millions of anxious families around the world. Would those ships cross the quarantine line? And if they did, what would happen next? On the morning of October 24, the first Soviet ships approached the quarantine line. Kennedy had ordered the U.S. Navy to intercept vessels carrying offensive military equipment if they attempted to cross. Around the world, people waited to see who would blink first. Then, just short of the quarantine line, several Soviet ships slowed, stopped, or turned back. Watching events unfold in real time, Secretary of State Dean Rusk delivered one of the most famous lines of the Cold War. "We're eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked." But the crisis was far from over. The missile sites already under construction in Cuba continued to move closer to becoming operational with every passing hour. Behind the scenes, Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev began exchanging messages, each searching for a way to step back without appearing to surrender. On October 26, Khrushchev sent the first of two extraordinary letters. It was personal, emotional, and strikingly candid. He warned of the catastrophic consequences of nuclear war and proposed a deal. The Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba if the United States publicly pledged never to invade the island again. For the first time since the crisis began, there appeared to be a possible path away from disaster. Kennedy took the proposal seriously. Then October 27 arrived, and everything nearly fell apart. Historians now call it Black Saturday. October 27, 1962 is widely regarded as the most dangerous day in human history. It began badly, and with each passing hour it grew worse. That morning, Kennedy received a second message from Khrushchev, this one broadcast publicly over Radio Moscow. Unlike the private letter from the day before, this one was firmer and introduced a new demand. Before the Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba, the United States would also have to withdraw its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The possible agreement Kennedy had begun considering suddenly became far more complicated. Publicly accepting the new demand would make it appear that the United States had backed down under Soviet pressure. While ExCom struggled to decide how to answer two very different messages from Khrushchev, another crisis erupted. An American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft had been shot down over Cuba. Its pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson Jr., was killed. The missile had been fired by Soviet forces in Cuba without authorization from Moscow. For the first time in the crisis, Americans and Soviets had exchanged deadly fire. Almost simultaneously, another U-2, flying a routine Arctic air sampling mission, accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace. Soviet MiG fighters scrambled to intercept it, while American fighters armed with nuclear air-to-air rockets raced to provide cover. For several terrifying minutes, armed aircraft from both superpowers were operating in the same skies, one misunderstanding away from catastrophe. Then came an extraordinary message from Havana. Convinced that an American invasion was imminent, Fidel Castro wrote to Khrushchev urging him to use nuclear weapons if the United States attacked Cuba, even though he believed Cuba itself would almost certainly be destroyed in retaliation. Khrushchev was appalled. He later replied that such a course would have meant the annihilation of the Cuban people and refused to consider it. But the most dangerous moment of all was unfolding far beneath the surface of the Caribbean Sea. A Soviet submarine, B-59, had spent days submerged with only limited communication from Moscow. Its batteries were nearly exhausted. The air conditioning had failed. Temperatures inside the vessel had climbed above 45 degrees Celsius. The crew was exhausted, dehydrated, and increasingly convinced that war might already have begun. When American destroyers located the submarine, they began dropping small practice depth charges, signals intended to force it to surface. The Soviet crew had no way of knowing they were only warning charges. To them, it sounded like the opening of an attack. Captain Valentin Savitsky believed he was already at war. He ordered the submarine's nuclear torpedo prepared. According to later accounts from officers aboard B-59, he declared, Maybe the war has already started up there. We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all. The political officer agreed. On most Soviet submarines, that would have been enough. But aboard B-59, launch authority also required the approval of the flotilla chief of staff, Vasily Arkhipov. Arkhipov refused. He believed the explosions were warning signals, not the beginning of a war. He argued with Savitsky until the captain finally relented. Instead of launching the nuclear torpedo at the American naval force surrounding them, B-59 surfaced and awaited further instructions. No one aboard the American ships knew that a nuclear weapon had nearly been fired. No one in Washington knew. No one in Moscow knew. The world would not learn how close it had come to nuclear war for decades. On the morning of October 28, Radio Moscow broadcast a message from Khrushchev to Kennedy. The Soviet Union would dismantle its missile sites in Cuba and remove its offensive weapons from the island. Publicly, the Cuban Missile Crisis was over. What the announcement did not reveal was that a confidential understanding had also been reached during a private meeting the previous evening between Robert Kennedy and Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin. The United States would remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey within a few months, quietly, without any public announcement, and without acknowledging that the move was connected to Cuba. The version of events that entered the public imagination was simple. Kennedy had stood firm, Khrushchev had backed down, and the United States had won. The fuller truth was more complicated. Both sides had made concessions, and that secret understanding remained hidden from the public for more than 25 years. In the weeks that followed, Soviet missiles left Cuba. On November 20th, the United States lifted the naval quarantine. In the months afterward, both governments, shaken by how close they had come to nuclear war, worked to improve direct communication between Washington and Moscow. The result was the Hotline Agreement of 1963. Despite the popular image of a red telephone, the original hotline was actually a secure text communications link designed to reduce the risk of catastrophic misunderstandings in future crises, thus bringing an end to the Cuban Missile Crisis. As for Vasily Arkhipov, he returned to the Soviet Union and continued his naval career, eventually rising to the rank of vice admiral. He rarely spoke publicly about what had happened aboard B-59, and according to his wife, he seldom discussed it even at home. He died in 1998 from cancer, an illness widely believed to have been linked to radiation exposure during the 1961 K-19 submarine accident. In 2002, at a conference marking the 40th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a retired Soviet naval officer who had served aboard B-59 publicly revealed just how close the submarine had come to launching its nuclear torpedo. Among those listening was Thomas Blanton. After hearing the account, he delivered a line that has echoed through the history of the crisis. A man called Vasily Arkhipov saved the world. Arkhipov had been dead for 4 years. Only then was the wider world beginning to understand what he had done. That is the part of the Cuban Missile Crisis worth remembering. Not only the speeches, not only the ships turning back, not only the letters exchanged between two leaders who, when it mattered most, chose restraint over escalation, but also the countless moments when individual judgment prevented irreversible catastrophe. We survived because people, under extraordinary pressure, made extraordinary decisions. We also survived because we were lucky. More than once. The real question is not whether we were lucky in 1962. We know we were. The question is how many times humanity can keep relying on luck, and whether, the next time the world comes this close to catastrophe, there will be another Vasily Arkhipov to say no.